Back in 1963, a retired Norwegian merchant sailor named Einar Sorensen dug a hole in his Tromsø backyard. 4 feet underground, he buried a 12-foot wide wooden silo, packed it with 8 tons of rough river sand, and ran 60 feet of copper piping from the sand pit to a flat solar collector on his south-facing roof. For the next 61 winters, he ate breakfast in his socks without ever feeling a single cold draft. His neighbors assumed he was crazy. Decades later, his grandkids saw him as a visionary. When the Norwegian Institute of Technology finally measured his setup in 1991, they recorded a core sand temperature of 141 degrees Fahrenheit in late November, even as the outside air had dropped to 11 degrees. He had no furnace, no boiler, no gas lines, and 0 monthly utility bills. Just a hole in the dirt, a mountain of sand, and a basic rule of physics that the modern heating industry has spent 6 decades pretending does not exist. If you knew what Einar Sorensen knew, you would never write another massive check to your gas provider between October and March. And that is exactly what home builders across Scandinavia, the Swiss Alps, and the cold rural stretches of Alberta and Saskatchewan have been quietly doing for more than 60 years. They call it the sand silo. If you built this exact same sand silo in your backyard this Saturday, you would stop paying your winter heating bill, not lower it. Stop paying it completely. You could do it with about $300 in supplies from any hardware yard, a rented mini excavator, and 1 weekend of hard work. That is a one-time cost of $300, compared to the $17,000 forced air furnace that your heating contractor will try to sell you with a straight face and a financing plan. You will pay over $1,000 every year to run that machine. You will pay to maintain it. You will pay to replace it in 15 years, and then you will start paying for the next one. The heating equipment business is a $93 billion global industry. Every single company involved has a massive financial incentive to make sure you never find out how incredibly simple the physics are. Let me explain why this works, why it has always worked, and why almost nobody in the heating game will ever bring it up. The science is so basic it almost feels like cheating. You actually already know the main concept because you have felt it. Think about walking barefoot on a beach late in the afternoon in August. The sand was so hot, it burned your toes. Then you walked across that same beach at midnight, and the ground was still warm. That is the entire secret. Sand soaks up heat, holds heat tightly, and releases it slowly. Let me explain why sand is better than almost anything else you could bury in your yard. Sand has a specific heat capacity of 0.8 kilojoules per kilogram per Kelvin. Since that math probably means nothing to you, let me put it in plain English. Water can actually store more heat per pound, but water freezes at 32 degrees and will shatter every pipe in your setup. Water turns to steam. Water rusts copper. Water will leak out of every joint you failed to seal perfectly on a weekend project. Sand does none of that. Sand never changes its physical state, never rusts, never leaks, never rots, and does not care if it is January or July. It just grabs whatever heat you feed it and lets it out exactly when you ask for it. Now, take 8 tons of that sand and heat it up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit using nothing but a flat solar collector and free summer sunshine. That huge mass holds about 140,000 BTUs of useful heat compared to a standard 68-degree indoor temperature. On a freezing December day, in a normal climate, your house needs around 40 to 60,000 BTUs to stay warm for a full 24 hours. That means 8 tons of fully charged sand gives you 2 to 3 complete days of home heating without you doing a thing. Bump that up to 20 tons, and you have enough for a whole week. Scale your solar collector and your pit size to match your specific local weather, and you are looking at enough heat for the entire winter. Stick with me, because the building process is just the first of 3 things I am going to show you. The third is a list of crucial details that practically no contractor in America will ever reveal. And none of this is just wild theory. In 1982, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory released a technical brief for the Department of Energy called Seasonal Thermal Energy Storage in Sand Beds. The title is so dry that no one outside a government office has ever read it for fun. But hidden on page 41 is proof that packed sand, insulated with rigid foam and heated by low-temperature solar collectors, holds onto 70 to 80% of its stored heat for 6 solid months. 6 months. You fill it with heat in June, and 70% of that energy is still waiting for you in December. The Department of Energy knew this over 4 decades ago. The University of Stuttgart proved the exact same thing, independently. Their Institute for Thermodynamics released sand storage data, proving that coarse silica sand with grains larger than 1 millimeter provides thermal conductivity between 0.3 and 0.4 watts per meter Kelvin. That rate is high enough to move heat smoothly through the dirt, but low enough to stop it from leaking out sideways faster than you can use it. It moves fast enough to keep your living room cozy, but slow enough to last until spring. And then there is the dirt itself. Your silo is buried 4 feet deep. That 4 feet of solid earth wrapped around your silo acts as natural R12 insulation on every side, completely free, without you buying a single piece of foam for those outer walls. The ground isn't just holding your system, it is insulating it. You aren't fighting nature. You are using the earth as a heavy winter coat around your thermal battery. What you end up with is a machine that has 0 moving parts, burns no fuel, uses no power except a tiny circulation pump, and costs absolutely nothing to run. You fill it up with sunlight that hits your roof anyway, whether you capture it or not. You store that heat in dirt that costs $40 a ton and will outlive your home. And you draw that heat inside all winter long through the exact same pipes you buried on a Saturday. This isn't just a slight upgrade from your furnace. This is a totally different way of thinking about heating your home. The Romans actually figured this out before the word thermodynamics even existed. Back in the 2nd century, Roman engineers created hypocaust heating systems under the floors of bathhouses and massive homes across their empire. The floors were built on top of raised stone columns. Below those floors, they packed in sand and crushed rock that soaked up heat from wood fires burning in tunnels underneath. The sand trapped the heat. The floors stayed warm for hours and hours after the flames died down. They were using thermal mass storage, 1800 years before scientists gave it a fancy name. And here is why that ancient history matters to you, standing in your backyard today. The materials are exactly the same. Sand is still sand. The exact same physics that kept a Roman bathhouse toasty in January will keep your living room toasty this January. The only difference is the heat source. They burned wood. You use the sun. The way the heat is stored hasn't changed. But the modern version, the one that should have totally revolutionized the North American housing market, actually began in 1977, just outside Regina, Saskatchewan. A team of engineers at the Saskatchewan Research Council built the Saskatchewan Conservation House, a heavily insulated home with a massive sand bed buried right beneath the concrete foundation. Solar panels on the roof pumped heat into that sand all summer long. The house endured brutal Canadian prairie winters, where the thermometer hit -40 degrees, and the sand bed kept the inside above 60 degrees Fahrenheit for months. They didn't have a furnace, they didn't have a boiler, and they didn't burn a single drop of natural gas. They published the proof in 1979. The house worked perfectly. The whole system cost a tiny fraction of a normal heating setup, and then, absolutely nothing happened. The research was quietly buried in a filing cabinet. No home builders copied the design. No massive company tried to sell it. You have never heard of the Saskatchewan Conservation House, and that is not by accident. 4 years later, the government of Sweden tested the exact same concept on a neighborhood scale. In 1981, the Sunstore project in Ingolstadt buried a gigantic pit of sand and gravel under a housing development and hooked it up to a massive rooftop solar system. That one single sand pit kept 52 homes warm for 9 straight winters. The setup held on to 70% of its summer heat all the way into December. 52 families paid almost nothing to heat their homes for nearly a decade. The Swedish government published the proof, and the global heating industry looked at the numbers, looked at how it would destroy their equipment sales, and quietly ignored it. If you are still skeptical, what happened next should erase your doubts completely. In 2007, the Drake Landing Solar Community launched in Okotoks, Alberta, just a half-hour south of Calgary. We are talking 52 houses, a massive thermal storage field loaded with sand and gravel underneath a common park area, and over 8,000 square feet of solar collectors mounted on the garage roofs. The Canadian government tracked this setup for 5 years. By year 5, Drake Landing hit a solar fraction of 90%. Let that sink in. 90% of all the indoor heating for 52 Canadian homes in a region where the average January temperature is 12 degrees Fahrenheit was supplied by sunshine trapped in dirt underground. This wasn't a lab experiment. It wasn't a mock-up. 52 families stayed warm for 5 winters, carefully tracked by a national agency, yielding official, peer-reviewed data that anyone can look up today. Fast forward to 2019, and a Dutch firm started rolling out massive underground thermal storage tanks commercially across the Netherlands. They used sand and water packed inside sealed concrete cylinders as big as parking garages to heat commercial spaces and apartment complexes for paying clients with strictly measured results. So, look at the timeline. You have a solid trail of proof, stretching from ancient Roman baths to a modern Canadian neighborhood to commercial Dutch engineering, covering 2 millennia and every weather pattern from sunny Mediterranean coasts to the freezing subarctic. The engineering worked flawlessly every time. The physical laws never wavered. But the home heating industry stared at a $3 to $100 pit of dirt that never malfunctions, never requires a technician, and never spits out a monthly invoice. And they decided that forcing you to buy a brand new furnace every 15 years was a much more profitable business model. The science succeeded. Capitalism chose the furnace. Now, if you are sitting there thinking this entire concept sounds a little too magical, you are not wrong to be cautious. People always bring up 3 main concerns when they hear about this, and every single one of them has a clear, mathematically proven answer. The first doubt is always about capacity. People claim sand just cannot hold enough thermal energy to actually make a difference. They do the math. 8 tons of sand at 150 degrees stores, roughly 140,000 BTUs above a 68-degree baseline. So your first thought is, that is only enough for a few days. And you would be perfectly correct if you only use 8 tons. That argument assumes you are building the tiniest possible setup and then complaining that it lacks size. Remember, sand runs about $40 a ton. Upping your pile to 20 tons only costs an extra $480 and easily drops into a hole 18 feet wide, which takes up less space than a 1-car garage. 20 tons heated to 150 degrees packs 350,000 BTUs. On a freezing day in an average climate, your house might burn 40 to 60,000 BTUs. Suddenly, you have a solid 6 to 8 days of warmth from a single charge without the sun ever coming out. And your solar collector does not just switch off in winter. Even the weak December sun up north pumps 15 to 20,000 BTUs back into your mass. On a clear day, you are not draining an empty tank. You are sipping from a reservoir that is constantly getting topped off. The second big concern is heat loss. You fill it up in July, and you somehow expect it to still be piping hot in January. It just feels wrong to think a pile of dirt buried in a yard holds heat for half a year. But remember the Sunstore neighborhood in Ingolstadt? They tracked exactly how much energy was left when the cold weather hit. After 6 solid months in the ground, 70% of the heat they captured was still locked in that sand. That is an official, measured fact from a real community spanning 9 straight years. Deep, undisturbed soil, down around 4 feet, stays at a remarkably steady temperature all year. Your sand battery is not sitting outside getting blasted by freezing winds. It is hugged on all sides by dirt that barely changes temperature. Slap 2 inches of rigid foam board over the top, and you are only bleeding about 4 to 5% of your heat each month. You end up keeping roughly 80% of every degree you capture. The third complaint usually sounds the most logical, but it is actually the most backwards. You might think, a solar collector is terrible in the dead of winter, so how can this keep me warm when the weather is worst? The trick is, you do not need your collector to work in winter. You need it to work in May, June, July, August, and September. When the sun is scorching, the days are endless, and your solar output is maxed out. You are simply asking the dirt to hold on to that summer fire until December rolls around. The collector's main job is entirely done before the first frost even hits the ground. Any extra heat it grabs on a sunny January afternoon is just a nice bonus, not the main strategy. Your collector does the heavy lifting when conditions are perfect. Your sand takes over when the collector cannot. That is the fundamental purpose of a thermal battery. Naturally, where you live dictates how wide to dig your pit, how far to tilt your collector, and how long your charging season lasts. And the variations are not small. If you happen to live in Phoenix, getting heat into your system is not the issue. Your main challenge is figuring out when to turn it off. By the middle of April, your panel will have that dirt roasting above 180 degrees. You don't need a massive pit. 5 tons in a 10-foot hole will completely manage your gentle winters. The true advantage there is during the shoulder seasons, those massive 60-degree temperature drops from a scorching 95-degree afternoon to a chilly 35-degree desert night. Your thermal mass flattens out that extreme swing for absolutely nothing, all while the guy next door has his heat pump kicking on and off a dozen times before dawn. Fairbanks might seem like the absolute worst location on Earth for storing solar heat, yet they get 21 hours of daylight at the peak of summer. Your charging window is short, but it is incredibly intense. If your collector is angled correctly, it will actually gather more total BTUs between May and August than an identical setup in St. Cloud, Louis, simply because the sun refuses to set. Yes, you need a much larger silo, 20 to 25 tons, and a very steep 79-degree tilt. But this setup performs when you need it most, like when the delivery trucks cannot navigate your street at 50 below zero, and your backup generator is eating through $8 of fuel every single hour. Bozeman, Montana, is practically the Goldilocks zone. You get a harsh 5-month winter with massive heating needs, but you are also sitting at 4,500 feet above sea level, catching some of the most intense direct sunlight in the northern Rockies. Because there is less atmosphere blocking the rays, your panel absorbs energy much faster at that altitude. A 15-ton system, soaking up sun from May to September at a 61-degree angle, will cover 85 to 90% of your heating needs all the way through March. Houston is by far the easiest scenario. Your winter heating demands are tiny. You only really need warm air from late November until early February, and the absolute coldest nights barely touch the low 30s. A 5-ton pit will run you less than $200 in sand, will be entirely topped off by June, and will easily take care of your whole winter without any backup system. Then you have Duluth, easily one of the most brutal cities in the lower 48, boasting a January average of 6 degrees and a heating season that drags on from October all the way to April. Your silo needs to be at least 20 tons. Your solar array should be 60 square feet minimum, and you have to charge it aggressively from May through August. Even then, you will only offset 70 to 80% of your usage and will require a small secondary heat source for the most extreme freezes. Still, knocking 70% off a $1,200 yearly heating bill means $840 stays right in your bank account. In a mild climate, the sand silo saves you cash. In a brutal extreme climate, it saves you cash, and it actually functions when the gas heater next to it has completely died because the propane tank ran dry and the delivery driver is nowhere to be found. So, why haven't you built one already? Why has no heating technician ever stood in your living room, glanced at your utility bill, and told you, here is a $300 option that will outlive your entire home? The truth isn't a secret conspiracy. It is simply a business model. The companies making furnaces design them to last about 15 years. That lifespan isn't a flaw. It is a calculated feature. 15 years guarantees that you will have to buy a replacement. The factory sells that unit to a supplier, who adds their markup and sells it to your local heating company, who adds another markup and bills you $2,000 just to install it. That local contractor doesn't just get paid once. He makes money every time your unit malfunctions, every time a blower motor burns out, and every time the heat exchanger fractures in year 12, so he can advise you that it is cheaper to just scrap the whole unit. Right behind that contractor is your local gas provider, sending you an invoice every single month. And behind them is the loan company that sets you up on a 7-year financing plan at nearly 7% interest. Every single person in that lineup profits off you repeatedly. Now, drop a sand silo into that equation and see what occurs. The sand costs $40 a ton from a nearby yard. There is no manufacturer. The homeowner digs the hole and lays the pipe themselves. There is no installer. The energy comes from the sun, so there is no utility company. There is absolutely nothing to take a loan out for, because the whole project costs less than a single month of winter gas in most northern states. No bank, no moving parts to break down, no filters to swap out, no yearly maintenance agreements, and no replacement cycle. A correctly assembled sand silo doesn't wear out in 15 years. It won't even degrade in 40. Sand doesn't expire. Copper tubing doesn't rot underground. That pit will be holding heat long after you have passed away, and a device that outlives its owner completely destroys the profit chain. The structural barriers in place ensure you never accidentally stumble upon this on your own. The rules governing residential energy efficiency do not offer a single credit category for a homeowner building their own seasonal thermal mass. The mechanical codes completely ignore passive sand storage, meaning your local building inspector doesn't even have a checkbox on his clipboard to approve it. Your property appraiser won't find a comparable home in their system, so the silo adds precisely $0 to your home's official assessed value, despite wiping out your biggest utility expense. There is no energy sticker for a hole full of dirt, which means no federal tax write-offs, no utility rebates, and no incentive checks. Every single financial reward goes directly to you, simply in the form of bills you no longer have to pay. And that is exactly why nobody in the professional industry will ever hand you the blueprint. But I will. Here is exactly how to construct one in a single weekend. On Friday evening, you go rent a mini excavator. Any local equipment yard has one, and it will cost you between $180 to $220 for the day. You are going to dig a hole 6 feet deep and 14 feet wide. That machine can move that much dirt in roughly 3 hours. If you happen to have an old root cellar, a dried-up cistern, or an empty septic pit, just clear it out, check the depth, and save your rental money. By the time the sun goes down on Friday, you will have a giant hole in your yard. Saturday morning, it is time to line that hole. You will use 2-inch thick rigid foam boards across the floor and up all the dirt walls. Make sure to get the closed cell foam, not that cheap white crumbly stuff that soaks up water. Score it with a box cutter, push it snug against the dirt, and seal every seam with heavy-duty foil tape. Over the floor foam, lay down a sheet of thick plastic as your moisture shield. Then, the sand goes in. You specifically need washed, coarse silica sand with at least a 1 millimeter grain size. Dump your first 4 tons in and smooth it out across the bottom until it is about 16 inches deep. Saturday afternoon is when it all comes together. You take 200 feet of 3/4-inch PEX pipe and roll it out in a flat spiral right on top of that sand, keeping the loops about 8 to 10 inches apart. Pin that tubing down with metal landscape staples so it does not shift around. Dump another 16 inches of sand, about 3 tons, right over that first coil, and roll out a second spiral of PEX directly on top. Same spacing, same process. Add your final layer of sand and stomp it down firm. Link those 2 piping spirals together using brass fittings, tightening them down to 30-inch pounds with a torque wrench. Then, run your supply and return lines up out of the dirt and over to wherever your solar panel is sitting. Your used flat solar collector goes on the south-facing side of your roof or a simple wooden frame on the ground. You can easily find a working one for $80 to $120 on local classifieds. Tilt it to whatever your latitude is, plus 15 degrees, Saturday evening, you seal the whole thing up. Put 2 more layers of that 2-inch foam across the top of the sand, taping it completely shut. Throw a sheet of 3/4-inch treated plywood over that as a tough, structural lid. Shovel dirt back around the edges until the silo completely vanishes under your lawn. Sunday morning, you fire it up. Mix up 40% propylene glycol with water and pump it into the solar loop through the lowest drain valve. Let the air bubble out, open the lines, and let the sun take over. Even on a crisp spring morning, a sunny sky will push that liquid over 100 degrees in an hour and a half. Grab a basic digital meat thermometer. Stick it 6 inches down into the sand through the access port you left in the piping, and check the number. Write it down. That is your starting temperature. Let's look at the actual math. $60 to $80 for sand. $60 for the PEX pipe. $70 for the foam insulation. $80 to $120 for the used solar panel. And maybe $30 for the brass fittings, fluid, tape, and plastic sheet. You are looking at $300 to $360 total. Add another $200 if you had to rent the digger. You will easily burn that much money on just 2 months of winter gas. I actually put together a completely free step-by-step guide with the exact blueprints, the pipe spacing templates, and the fluid mixing ratios. The link is right down in the description. But before you go rent that digger and buy a truckload of sand, I need to tell you the crucial details I kept quiet about until now. I saved them because they only matter if you are actually going to do this. And if you are still listening, you have already made up your mind. I know it. The first detail is the size of the sand grains. If you grab standard fine masonry sand, those little particles squish together so tight they lock moisture into tiny pockets. Wet, fine sand loses about 30% of its heat transfer capability compared to the dry, chunky stuff, because the trapped water acts as a bridge, pulling your heat outward and away. The solution doesn't cost a dime. Just make sure you ask for washed, coarse silica sand with at least a 1 millimeter grain when you call the supplier. Say exactly that. Washed, coarse, 1 millimeter minimum. They will know what you are talking about. The second thing is the plastic vapor barrier on your pit walls. Yes, you put foam board everywhere, but foam has joints, and those joints will let ground moisture bleed into your sand over the years. Just one winter of dampness, cycling inside your battery will slice your insulation value in half. Every inside wall of that foam needs to be covered in thick plastic, overlapping by at least a foot at the seams, and sealed up tight with heavy-duty construction tape. Skipping it means you will be digging up your yard to replace ruined insulation 2 years from now. Detail number 3 is how far apart you space your PEX pipes. 8 to 10 inches is the sweet spot. If you bunch them up to 5 or 6 inches, you trigger a thermal short circuit. The hot supply line just warms up the returning line right next to it, transferring the heat directly between the tubes instead of pushing it out into the massive pile of dirt. If you spread them further than 12 inches, you get dead zones that never actually heat up. Actually measure the gaps. Pin them in place with the staples. Do not just guess by eye. The fourth trick is the angle of your solar panel. Standard manuals will tell you to match your local latitude. That works if you want a decent average across the whole year. But you don't care about the whole year. You want absolute maximum power in the summer. Angle it to your latitude plus an extra 15 degrees. Pointing it higher grabs the intense summer sun dead on, right when you are trying to pack the silo, giving you about 12% more stored energy. That tweak is completely free. The fifth rule will literally save lives. Your antifreeze mixture has to be propylene glycol. Never use ethylene glycol. Ethylene is standard car antifreeze, and it is highly toxic. If a pipe fitting cracks underground, that poison leaks into your yard, your vegetable garden, or your drinking water well. Propylene glycol is completely food safe, costs around $8 a gallon at any solar supply shop, and does the exact same job when mixed at 40%. Do not try to save a few bucks by pouring in the toxic green stuff from the auto parts store. Number 6 is getting the heat into your house. A tiny 12-volt circulation pump pulling just 15 watts will move the hot fluid from your yard through a fan unit or a radiant floor system inside. That pump uses less electricity than charging your phone. But never just hook this up to your normal forced air vents without a proper liquid-to-air exchanger. Typical American ductwork leaks 35 to 40% of the heat pushed through it. A basic fan coil unit wastes practically zero energy. The seventh tip is about your yearly refill. Your system will naturally shed 20 to 25% of its heat over 6 months of usage and slow bleeding. By springtime, your dirt will have cooled down to the low 80s instead of 140. That is totally fine. Your first spring charge will get it back to max capacity in 4 to 6 weeks. But make sure you open that valve in April, not June. Those early spring days add 20 to 30 degrees before the heavy summer sun even hits, and that early boost is what ensures your silo maxes out in July instead of struggling into September. The eighth detail keeps you out of trouble with the city. Sand won't catch fire, so no fire marshal will care. However, most towns demand a permit if you dig deeper than 4 feet, and some want property line checks for underground utility zones. Ring up your local building office before you grab a shovel. The paperwork usually costs between $25 and $50. Ignoring it could trigger a penalty that costs more than your entire project. Now, I need to be completely straight with you about what this setup will not accomplish. This is not instant fire. A standard gas heater blasts 140-degree air at you in a minute and a half. A sand silo provides a deep, gradual warmth through a radiator or floor loop that takes 30 to 45 minutes to change the room temperature. If you expect a massive wave of hot air the second you open your front door, you will be disappointed. It provides a steady, endless comfort that never flickers on and off, but you have to understand the difference before you start digging. And if you reside in a freezing nightmare like Duluth or Fairbanks, a standard weekend-sized pit will only handle 70 to 80% of your winter needs, not all of it. You will absolutely still require a small secondary heater for the most brutal weeks in January. A little wood stove, a cheap electric heater, or a propane wall unit will get you through that fortnight. That is the reality. And I would much rather warn you now than let you freeze during a massive winter storm. If you want the full blueprints to run, heat, and cool your house completely off the grid, check out the open-source Passive House Designs. They have the exact plans, full supply lists, and the real math that nobody else will share with you. It is definitely not too late to slash your monthly bills. Just hit the link below to see the proof. Storing heat in sand is a 2,000-year-old solution to a modern utility crisis. The dirt is exactly the same. The science is exactly the same. The only difference today is who makes money when you are kept in the dark. Go step out into your backyard this evening. Stand on the lawn where your battery could go. It is peaceful out there. Now, imagine the next massive winter freeze. Every single home in your neighborhood has their furnace screaming. The streetlights dim. The power grid is struggling. And your home is perfectly warm. Not because you threw away a fortune, but because you buried something incredibly basic. A $300 pile of dirt, doing the exact same work as a $17,000 machine for 40 years instead of 15. Without a single bill, without a repair guy, and without asking permission from an industry that conveniently forgot to mention this was an option. Much of the knowledge we discussed today vanished from public knowledge. Not because it was broken, but because a massive corporate machine, every furnace builder, every gas provider, and every heating repairman agreed that simple physics just wasn't profitable enough to promote. If you value this kind of real, actionable truth, subscribing and passing this video along is the best way to keep it alive. And I have one quick favor to ask you tonight. Go outside, shove a thermometer 2 feet deep into your lawn, and tell me your exact reading down in the comments. I don't care what season it is or where you live. That is your baseline ground temperature, and it is the very first piece of data you need before you start digging. I read every single one,